Welcome to the channel Liturgy of Slaves. Oh, the river is wide, and the road is long. Since the break of dawn, I've been walking here. My heart stays strong, though my feet are heavy. Hold on. Hold on to the promise of freedom, to the glory. In 1880, 15 years after the Civil War ended, many freed men in Texas still carried the deep scars from generations of slavery. They dreamed that dignity, justice, and equal opportunity would finally come with freedom. In cities like Houston, Galveston, and Dallas, some progress could be seen. Black communities opened schools, churches, and small businesses. But in the countryside, where cotton dominated life, the story was very different. Those former slaves who had once worked under chains were now being pulled back into the same fields, this time under the disguise of what was called free labor. To recreate slavery in a new form, landowners and planters used contracts and laws. Freed families, often unable to read or write, were promised stability and wages. But reality was harsher. They discovered that the system of freedom was fragile. And in rural Texas counties such as Navarro and Limestone, the chains were simply replaced by threats and paper contracts. For many, the promise of liberty turned into disappointment. Instead of owning land or working independently, they remained tied to the cotton rows from sunset to sunrise. The dream of a better life was pushed further away, leaving only hope that something might finally change the next season. Arrival on cotton plantations. When recruiters and landowners spread word of work opportunities, freed black families often walked for miles to plantations near towns like Corsicana, Waco, and Tyler. They carried what little they had, cooking pots, blankets, and sometimes just the clothes on their backs. Many believed they would be offered fair wages, simple housing, and a chance to rebuild their lives. Upon arrival, they were greeted with promises written on long sheets of paper they could not read. The contracts were read aloud by white men who assured the workers it was a partnership. But between the lines, the truth was carefully hidden. The plantation still looked the same. Endless cotton rows stretched across the horizon, wooden cabins lined up in rows, and overseers patrolled on horseback with whips at their sides. Families were assigned to cabins made of rough planks with dirt floors and small fireplaces for cooking. The excitement of starting anew quickly faded as they realized they had entered another trap. Though no longer legally slaves, they were surrounded by the same structures, the same cotton, and the same harsh discipline. For many, arriving at these plantations felt like stepping back into bondage, disguised as freedom, where hope was traded for survival. The false agreements. Once the families settled into the cabins of the cotton plantations, the truth of their situation began to unfold. Landowners presented them with contracts, long documents filled with complicated language and numbers that most freed men could not understand. Illiteracy was common among former slaves in Texas since education had been deliberately denied to them for centuries. A white clerk or overseer would read the terms aloud, often twisting the meaning to sound fair and reasonable. They promised food, clothing, tools for farming, and a portion of the profits from the cotton harvest. But hidden inside these agreements were endless charges, fees for housing, for every meal, for every tool, even for medical visits. By the time workers signed their names with an X, they had unknowingly agreed to a system that chained them through debt. The papers made it appear voluntary. Yet in truth, it was a trap that gave all power to the landowners. The contracts were also enforced by local law, making it nearly impossible to challenge them. Once the signatures were made, the families discovered they had little control over their lives. The false agreements were not just about labor. They represented the continuation of slavery under a new name, where the cotton fields became open-air prisons. And every harvest season tightened the grip of bondage. The cycle of debt. By the summer of 1880, freedmen working under these false contracts began to realize they could never escape the cycle. At the end of each harvest, when they expected payment, the landowners presented a ledger of debts. Instead of wages, families were told they owed money for every sack of cotton picked, every meal eaten, every piece of cloth used for clothing, and every nail hammered into their cabins. The numbers were always balanced against the worker. Even those who picked cotton from sunrise to sunset, filling heavy sacks that tore at their backs and hands, discovered that their labor was worth less than their debt. The system was carefully designed so that no one could ever break free. If a worker tried to leave, the landowner could call the sheriff, claiming breach of contract. Under local laws, this was treated as a crime, and the freedman could be arrested and forced back into the fields under guard. Some workers tried to argue or resist, but the threat of violence kept most silent. The debt system was a cruel weapon. It turned freedom into another form of slavery. Families passed entire seasons working only to fall deeper into obligation, never seeing profit, never owning land, and never truly escaping the chains of cotton. For many, the cycle of debt felt worse than the whips of the past because it disguised slavery behind the mask of legality, trapping generation after generation in endless servitude. Violence as control. On the cotton fields of Texas in 1880, violence remained the strongest weapon of control. Although the law declared slavery ended, the everyday reality proved different. Overseers, often armed and on horseback, carried clubs, rifles, and whips to enforce discipline. A worker who questioned an order or slowed his pace could be beaten in front of others as a warning. Families remembered scenes from slavery days now repeated in so-called freedom. Whipping left scars across shoulders and backs, and sometimes workers were tied to posts to suffer under the burning Texas sun. Children, too, were not spared from intimidation. The sharp crack of a whip or the sound of gunshots fired into the air echoed across the rows, reminding everyone of their place. Violence was not only physical. It was psychological. Landowners used threats of eviction, jail, and starvation to keep people in line. The constant fear forced many to accept their conditions in silence, believing any resistance would bring greater punishment. For women, the threat of abuse carried a heavy shadow, as overseers often used their power to intimidate and exploit them. In towns like Corsicana and Brenham, violence became the silent law of the fields, a continuation of old practices under a new disguise. This climate of terror showed that freedom without protection was fragile and the cotton fields remained ruled by fear rather than justice. Local authorities complicit. Before we continue with our story, if you're enjoying it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next real stories about slavery. Let's continue. The machinery that held freed men captive in 1880 Texas was not maintained by landowners alone. It relied on the complicity of local authorities, sheriffs, county judges, and constables, many of whom had once defended slavery and now enforced the contracts that tied workers to plantations. When freedmen complained of abuse, their voices were ignored in courtrooms where white planters held influence. The law of vagrancy was used as a weapon. If a black worker left a plantation without permission, he could be arrested for having no lawful employment. Once jailed, he might be fined an amount he could never pay. To settle the debt, the sheriff would lease him back to the same landowner, continuing the cycle of forced labor. Court records from counties like McLennan and Navarro reveal that the system was carefully organized to protect the interests of cotton planters. The promise of justice for freed men rarely existed outside of paper. Even small-town mayors and constables profited, receiving payments from planters for each worker forced back into the fields. Local newspapers controlled by white elites often described freed men as lazy or criminal, justifying the harsh treatment. The reality was different. Families only wanted dignity and fair wages. But with the authorities standing beside the landowners, there was little chance of escaping the grip of debt and violence. In practice, the courthouse and the cotton field worked together, turning freedom into a legal illusion. Life in the quarters. Beyond the endless rows of cotton, the freed families lived in wooden quarters that looked almost identical to the slave cabins of the past. These small structures, built from rough planks with gaps that let in dust and wind, were lined up along the edge of the plantation, often in clusters resembling miniature villages. Inside, the floors were bare dirt, and a small fireplace or iron stove was used for heating and cooking. Several children might share a single straw mattress, while adults slept on blankets spread across the floor. The quarters were crowded with families of 5 or 6 packed into spaces no larger than a small stable. Conditions bred sickness, infections, fevers, and coughs spread easily, especially among children. Food was rationed by the plantation store, and workers were forced to buy staples like cornmeal, salt pork, or molasses at inflated prices, which were then added to their debts. Even leisure was restricted. Families gathered at night to pray, sing hymns, or tell stories. But these moments were shadowed by exhaustion and the constant fear of overseers. Women carried the heaviest burden, balancing endless field work with cooking, caring for children, and keeping the home alive. For children, childhood was cut short. They worked from dusk to dawn, dragging sacks of cotton almost as large as themselves. The life in the quarters revealed the contradiction of 1880 Texas. Freedom existed on paper. But inside these cabins, bondage was alive, shaping every step and every breath of those who dreamed of true liberty. Resistance and small acts of defiance. Even in the face of constant control, freed men and their families found ways to resist, often carefully and quietly. Open rebellion was nearly impossible in 1880 Texas, where the threat of jail, whips, or guns was ever present. But within the cotton rows and cabins, small acts of defiance kept hope alive. Workers sometimes slowed their pace in the fields, pretending exhaustion to resist the overseer's demands. Others hid small portions of food or cotton to help neighbors in greater need. Secret gatherings became a vital form of strength. At night, by the light of hidden fires or lanterns, families came together for prayer meetings or to sing spirituals that reminded them of their worth as human beings. These gatherings also became places where elders taught the younger ones to write and read, passing along precious knowledge that could one day break the chains of false contracts. Women often led this quiet resistance, protecting children from overseers, organizing secret food exchanges, or warning others of patrols. In some quarters, men and women drafted plans of escape, sharing whispered news of families who had fled north to Dallas or across the Sabine River into Louisiana. Every act, no matter how small, was a rejection of the system that tried to crush them. Resistance did not always roar with violence. It often moved in songs, whispers, and secret lessons, proving that even under chains of debt, the human spirit searched for freedom. Rumors of escape. By late 1880, whispers of escape traveled across the plantations of Texas like sparks carried by the wind. In the cabins during hushed conversations after long days of labor, families spoke about neighbors who had disappeared under cover of night. Some were said to have reached Dallas, where opportunities for work were greater and where black communities were slowly gaining independence. Others headed eastward toward Shreveport in Louisiana, following rivers and dirt trails that once guided freedom seekers during the war. Escape was dangerous, for overseers and local sheriffs treated runaways as criminals. Patrols searched roads and dogs trained to track human scent prowled the countryside. Still, desperation pushed many to risk everything. Parents often debated late into the night whether to stay and endure or to risk the journey with children too young to walk long distances. Stories circulated of families caught and dragged back in chains, beaten as a warning to others. Yet alongside these tales of failure, there were also legends of success. A man from McLennan County was said to have vanished into the night and later sent word that he found work in the railroads of Houston. These rumors gave hope to those who remained trapped, even if only half true. They reminded the workers that freedom still existed beyond the cotton rows. For many, just believing in the possibility of escape was a form of survival, a way to keep faith alive in the face of endless oppression. Legacy of bondage in freedom's era. As the year 1880 closed, the truth became clear for freed men in Texas. Slavery had not disappeared. It had only changed form. The chains once made of iron were now made of false debts and paper contracts. The whips of overseers had been replaced by laws and ledgers. But the suffering remained. Generations who dreamed of building schools for their children or owning land saw those dreams postponed year after year. The cotton economy thrived, but it was built on the backs of children, women, and men still trapped in submission and poverty. Communities that should have been growing stronger after emancipation instead faced cycles of displacement, sickness, and hunger. In counties like Navarro, McLennan, and Limestone, the story repeated itself endlessly. Families forced to labor from sunrise to sunset, yet never free to choose their future. This legacy of bondage cast a long shadow over Texas. It showed how freedom on paper could be twisted into bondage in practice, leaving scars that would pass from one generation to the next. By the dawn of a new decade, many realized they were fighting not only for survival but for recognition as human beings in a society that still denied their dignity. The cotton fields had become silent prisons, and the legacy of bondage in an era of supposed freedom revealed one of the darkest contradictions in American history.